it looks into literature writing from countries with colonial experience in three different manners. So we're going to look at that. The turn to theory in 1980s. Can you see the screen?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, the turn to theory in post-colonial studies. So now we're going to look at what is theory in post-colonial studies and what are they trying to do when you talk about the term post-colonial studies. So now, what is the background? We have already seen Orientalism established this particular way of looking at the literature coming out of the colonies. Orientalism by Edward Said. And then this is again a departure, a movement from the earlier liberal humanist approaches which critiqued Commonwealth literature. Like earlier liberal approaches, they looked at Commonwealth literature and what was their methodology? They tried to compare it to the English canon. They tried to look for common elements. They tried to look for the, you could say, the universal and the timelessness in literature, which actually did not do anything to the problems or the kind of experiences that was recorded by the people in the colonies. So you have a very clear cut departure from the earlier way of looking at literature from the colonies, and earlier it was called Commonwealth literature. So it was problematized, and now we have a move towards a new and exciting, and you can call it eclectic interdisciplinary discourse. It is interdisciplinary. Why? Because it takes into consideration theories from feminism, philosophy, psychology, politics, anthropology, and literary theory. So you can see how rich the field is. This particular field, we are talking about post-colonial studies. It is informed by the theoretical base, the theoretical knowledge from all these areas, all these fields. So it is essentially interdisciplinary. Please remember that it is essentially interdisciplinary. Now, under postcolonial studies, there are three ways. Please remember this. There are three ways or three forms of textual analysis. That is, they look into a text from three perspectives. There are three ways of understanding text from the colonies. Colonies, it also involves text from the colonized as well as the colonizers. So please remember that. So anyone with this colonial experience, so text from colonial backgrounds. So the first one is rereading canonical English literature. As I mentioned earlier, the example of Tempest. Tempest is English canon, right? One of the greatest of literary works. So it is kind of rereading. So you're reading at books already written, and in those works you're trying to look at how the whole experience of colonization works, how all the prejudices are there, and how these people are trying to voice protest against the same. All right, so we'll be looking this into detail. And the second one is we are looking into the representation of colonized subjects in all kinds of colonial texts, including literary ones. The second method is you're looking at the representation. That is, how are the colonized people painted? How are they shown in these English or mainly the British text, English text? How are the people shown? Are they shown as stupid, ignorant, ugly, licentious, sexually immoral? Is that how they are shown? That is the second way of looking at it. First one is rereading. Second one is looking for the representation of the colonized people. And the third one is writing back to the center. Now, what is writing back to the center? Here, you're looking at how all these colonial texts are, in a way, you could say, resisting the colonial project. So on the surface, it may look as if it is supporting colonialism, but when you really read it, you understand that it is actually a defiance. It's actually giving it back, a kind of a, you could say, a very a positive way of saying no to the colonial experiences. So once we come to that, it will be clear to you. what these theories are trying to tell us. So there are three forms of textual analysis based on post-colonial studies. One is the rereading the canonical English text. The other one is looking at the representation of the colonized subjects, and the other one is writing back to the center. Excuse me. Now, what do you mean by rereading canonical English literature? So we are looking at the past textbooks, and we are looking whether these texts perpetuate is to continue, to show it continuously, continued or question the latent assumptions of colonial discourses. What are the latent assumptions of colonialism? Latent assumption is that the West is superior. That is the West versus the other. They othered everything that was not Western. So Christianity was the only proper religion, and English was the best language. Their culture, tradition, and customs were supposed to be better than those followed by the people in the colonies. And because of all these, what happened? The people in the colonies were considered to be less than human, stupid, ignorant, silly, who needed to be succored, who needed to be taught, who needed to be brought out of this dirty mire into which they had fallen. So, therefore, you had these people starting schools, missionary discourses, conversion, all these things was part of the whole colonial enterprise. And using this, they were trying to legitimize their claim to the colonies. So in this particular approach, what we are doing is we are looking at these texts, and we are looking at whether the particular writer from a particular country is supporting the colonial discourses, or whether it is being very objective. Objective as in not following any of these colonial assumptions. So these critics, they examined writers who manifestly as in openly and clearly dealt with colonial themes. And the argument is whether the works are supportive or critical of colonial discourses. So one example here given is Joseph Conrad's Heart of the Matter, which talks about the whole colonial enterprise in Africa. So you have these white people going to Africa, and how they see Africa and Africans, and the kind of language that is used to describe Africa is actually studied in close detail. Here you can also write that example of Shakespeare's Tempest. So these, when you're talking about Tempest or Heart of the Matter, these are all clearly colonial text, because it talks about, or the stories about these colonies, and you have these British people, the you could say the British officials going to these countries for whatever work purposes, and how they experience and encounter Africa in terms of people, places, rituals, customs, traditions, etc. All right, so that is studied. And another is you pick up you pick up writers who seemingly have little to do with colonialism, and here what are you going to do is you're going to pick up texts which don't really directly talk about the colonial experience. Example, Jane Austen's Mansfield Park. It's supposed to be a love story. Then Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. Jane Eyre is also supposed to be a love story, a dark love story. But then if you go into a deeper reading of this, what do you get? There are undertones of the colonial discourse. That is, when we do that particular text, the White Sargasso Sea, it is connected to Jane Eyre. So from that, you can look at these texts from a colonial angle. We'll come to that later. So when you're rereading canonical English literature, what are you doing? First is you're looking at texts that directly deal with the colonial discourses, the colonial experience. The second one is again looking at the writers who apparently, that is on the surface, they have very little to do with colonialism. Maybe it's a love story, maybe it's a murder mystery, whatever. But then hidden in that story, you will find threads of the colonial experience. So one is the direct colonial text, the other one the texts that have very little to do with colonialism. So this consists of the methodology of rereading canonical English literature, rereading. So we are familiar with all these texts. Now we are going back to these texts again, and we are trying to understand it from the colonial perspective. So this is one way of the post-colonial understanding of the canonical English literature. The second one is we are looking at the representation of the colonized subjects. We are going to look at how these people are represented in the literary text. So this is highly influenced by the post-structuralist methodology of Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault, and Jacques Lacan. So the theory of deconstruction. I'm taking it for granted that you're familiar with, at least you know what is deconstruction. So that is the methodology used by uh, the people who study the representation of colonized subjects. So what is this method known as? It is called reading against the grain. Against the grain is apparently there is something on the surface, but then beneath that there is something, some kind of an underlying secret, underlying way of understanding a text. That is reading against the grain. So you're looking for examples of the colonized subjects resistance to colonial values. So according to this particular strain of reading, these critics, they tell that when you read a text, what are you doing? You're looking for a colonized subject's resistance to colonial values in that particular textbook. Maybe it is not direct, but indirectly their activities, maybe some words, some actions, it shows that how they were opposed to colonial rule and the colonial values. So you have names like Homi K. Bhabha and Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak. And also there were these group of scholars who studied subaltern studies. They also contribute quite a lot to this way of looking at uh, post-colonial study. So now Bhabha, what was he doing? He was reading colonial discourses as endlessly ambivalent, split and unstable, never able to instill colonial values they supported, and they were looking at the representation of colonized subjects. So what is he saying? Bhabha is saying that apparently on the surface the text looks as if colonialism was a nice enterprise, and the people in the colonies, they listened to and they obeyed whatever was imposed on them by the colonizers. But in reality, if you take a close study, that is, if you go do a close reading of the text, it will show that these texts, they show that these colonial discourses, they are ambivalent. Means it was not that very clear. The whites themselves were not able to uh, impose this on the people, and the people in the colonies, they were all the time questioning it, they were contesting it, and they were being resilient about the whole thing. So this can be seen in all these texts. So whatever the colonial values may be, it was never accepted by the colonized subjects. That's what Homi Bhabha is saying. So he's saying it is possible to see this defiance, possible to see the rebellion that was there in the colonized subjects in the text that we read. Now, looking at Spivak, what is she saying? Gayatri Spivak, she's saying um, she's exploring whether or not it was possible to recover the voices of those who had been made subjects of colonial representations, particularly women, and read them as potentially disruptive and subversive. So Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak, she was mainly interested in women. She's trying to look at how women experienced colonialism, but then we don't find many instances, we don't find many readings of that, and then it's not really explored also. But then she's again talking about the subalterns. Who are the subalterns? People at the fringes, people whose voice are never heard. So through the works like Subaltern Studies, Deconstructing Historiography, and Can the Subaltern Speak, this is a very very famous essay. Can the Subaltern Speak? It is considered to be one of the canonical texts, canonical pieces of literature from post-colonial colonial studies. So through this, what is she trying to see? I mean, what is she trying to explore? She's trying to understand whether these people, they were silenced, right? People in the colonies, they were silenced. They were not given an opportunity to speak up. So their voice, can it be heard through the literary text? That's what she's trying to explore. Can the subaltern speak? So were they silenced, or were there instances in literature and other works wherein these people were trying to make their voices heard. So she was also interested in women, but then you cannot say it was a very um, an overarching view wherein she is exploring everything in detail, but at least a beginning was made through Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak. Now, the third instance is called writing back to the center. Now, what is writing back? Writing back is this is again influenced by the theories of colonial discourses, and again, you're here when you're talking about writing back, you are mainly dealing with the literatures from countries with a history of colonialism. So you're looking at the new literatures. So writing back to the center could be seen as one of the latest ways of looking at the colonial experience. So new literatures from all these ex-colonies are looked at, and you're trying to see, understand the language. And then the argument is how these literary texts are mainly writing back to the center. Now, what is the center? Center is actually the countries that indulged in colonization. So you have centers like Great Britain, France, Portugal. These were the colonies, right? So these literary texts from these colonized countries, they are actually voicing their unhappiness through various methods in their text, and they are kind of writing back. It's kind of back answering to the center, wherein there is a questioning and falsifying colonial discourses in the work. Travestying is falsifying, so they are trying to prove as false whatever the colonial discourses said. So now you have the term Commonwealth being dropped. So the term Commonwealth gets dropped, and we call it post-colonial. So it's when we come to this particular way of studying, understanding the post-colonial experience, that you have the coining of the term post-colonial. So post-colonial is more interdisciplinary. We have already seen how it takes inspiration from feminism, post-structuralism, ethnography. All these areas come into the picture. So again, this move from Commonwealth to post-colonial, it involves this movement from the imperialistic connotations. So when you're talking about Commonwealth, you understand that once upon a time, British was like the grandmother, great queen or dame or grandmother, whatever, and you had all the other countries paying obeisance to Great Britain, and therefore we are kind of children of the same mother. That was the understanding, that imperialistic or dominating a kind of a power, which is now remembering and keeping all the ex-colonies under its shade and protection. So it had all kinds of negative connotations. So you have a movement from those negative connotations to a more interdisciplinary and a positive reading. So this way is very politically radical, and this is locally situated rather than universally relevant. So these new texts from these countries, they are studied from a political angle, and then the critics, they look for the local problems, the local experience, the local understanding, rather than looking for the universality and timelessness that was followed by the um, Commonwealth critics and writers. So now again, when you're talking about writing back to the center, this is again an act of decolonizing the mind. Decolonizing the mind. So you have a very, very important text when you're talking about this section of reading at post-colonial studies. The book is called The Empire Writes Back, Theory and Practice in Post-Colonial Literatures by Australian critics called Bill Ashcroft, Gareth Griffiths, and Helen Tiffin. Please remember the name. It came out in 1989. The Empire Writes Back. Look at the title. The empire is writing back. Empire consists of all these little different countries that were under the British rule. So the empire writes back. So theory and practice in post-colonial literatures by Bill Ashcroft, Gareth Griffiths, and Helen Tiffin. So what are they doing in this particular book? They're looking at how literatures from ex-colonies were mainly concerned with challenging the language of power, unlearning its worldview, and producing new modes of representation. So what are they trying to look at? They're looking at how the colonies, the ex-colonies, are making use of English in a new way. And in the process, what are they doing? English actually earlier stood for that colonial imperial power, so it had all kinds of negative connotation, and it continues even today. There is a section of people in our country who are still against English. Why do they believe that English is negative? Because for them it still connotes that imperial British power. It reminds them of that master slave relationship. But then another thing we need to remember is we have actually moved away from all that. We have appropriated and we have made English our own. It's become a part of the social fabric of the country, wherein it is just another language. But then still that connotation continues to be there in the minds of some people. All right. So, in this particular way of looking at the post-colonial experience, what are they looking at? These writers, they are looking at all the literature from these ex-colonies, and they're looking at the language in which they are written. Language by language, what I mean to say is English, and how they have appropriated and used English to their own advantage. We'll look at that in detail. So, how English language was being displaced by different linguistic communities in the post colonial world. So, earlier, when we talked about English, which English was supposed to be the best or the standard? British English. And later, with the rise of America, you had even the American English becoming prominent. But then, after that, now you have a shift to other emerging countries, third world countries. Even you have places like Canada and Australia, wherein the English is kind of different. The pronunciation is different. So they have also created their own brand of English. And in today's world, we have even Indian English, which is gaining popularity or which is gaining acceptance, because it is through this English that we have the BPO, business process outsourcing, and KPO industries thriving, and we are making use of English to our own advantage. And look at English. What has happened to English in India? Every state has its own version of English, yes or no? Malayali, a typical Malayali speaking English would sound as if it's kind of Malayalam. There's some kind of an influence of the mother tongue. But more or less, we have Indianized it. We have added words from our Indian repository. Different Indian languages have contributed different words to English. So wherever there was a word lacking in English, we substituted that with a vernacular word. So we have appropriated it and we have created this new brand called Indian English. So this is studied by Bill Ashcroft, Gareth Griffiths, and Helen Tiffin. So now what is happening is we are writing back in Englishes. Look at the title, Englishes. It's English with a small letter and in plural. So we don't have one standard English, as in one standard British English. Rather, what do we have is many varieties of English. So there's this need to decolonize English, that is free English from all its colonial connotations, all the colonial trappings. So post-colonial writing, it defines itself by seizing the language of the center. Seizing is by taking it by force, the language of the center. Language of the center is English. And replacing it in a discourse fully adapted to the colonized place. So what have we done is we have appropriated, we have taken it and we have replaced that standard British English with a brand of English which actually is adapted to our sensibilities and our requirements. So you have even so many words provided by India to the English lexicon. So this has been adapted. English has been adapted. See, most of us can switch between English and Malayalam or Hindi or whatever, even when it has become a part of our mental lexicon. So what have we done? We have actually adapted it. We have kind of changed it and we are using it. So you have the refashioning of the standard English with a capital E into new Englishes. So here this new Englishes E can be small letter also, wherein we are not seeing it as one standard scary kind of a language which needs to be followed. followed to the T, that is with perfection. So you can bend it, you can change it, you can distort it, whatever. So how do you do it? You're inserting untranslatable words into their text. So you have certain Malayalam or Gujarati or whatever word, and there is no proper translation available. So what do you do when you're writing and you have to write about that local experience? You're going to insert that Malayalam word or that Gujarati word into that English text by glossing seemingly obscure terms. Obscure terms, as in English, if there are terms that you don't understand, you simply just leave it. You gloss over it. You don't dwell on it and try to explain it. You don't do that. Then you refuse to follow standard English syntax, that grammar. You use structures derived from other languages. So instead of SVO, that is subject, verb, and object, that's a standard structure of English, that can be replaced with the structure used in any other language. So it can be VSO, it can be OSV, it can be any order. It can be in any order. You also incorporate many different creolized versions of English into the text. A creolized version. I hope you understand the term creoles, right? What's a creole? You haven't done this in linguistics. What is a creole? Creolized versions of language. That is, you're making it local. You're kind of mixing it. You're kind of joining two words and then using it with a local flavor. That is creolization. So you're incorporating many words into, it's kind of a chutnification, you could say, chutnification of English. The word chutnification comes from the word chutney. Chutney is a Indianized, sorry, a westernized form of chutney from chamandi. From that you have chutney, chutnification. So that becomes kind of English. So what are you doing is you're actually creating a new creolized version. And then again, writing back, what are you doing? Writing back in English is you're emphasizing on the writer's attempt to subvert. Subvert is to kind of change it totally and refashion standard English into new forms of English. You're refusing the colonial values which the old standard English stood for. You're discontinuing English that speaks from the center. That is that typical British English. You're throwing it away, and you're, what are you doing? You're appropriating, you're seizing, you're taking English to suit the vernacular sensibilities. That is, as a Malayali, we are seizing English to suit our Malayali sensibilities by mixing, using a lot of the vernacular. The complex speech habits of Malayalam are inserted into English, and we use that in writing a story, whatever. So you can give the example of Arundhati Roy, the god of small things. What has she done? She's done this. She's appropriated, she's seized English to suit the Malayali sensibility, wherein she's talking, she's telling us the story of the characters. It's a highly complex kind of a text. It's highly influenced by Malayalam speech habits, Malayalam history, Malayalam words, but still we call it an English text, whatever. But then in that text, what has happened? The old standard English with a capital E, the British English, has been totally refashioned, revamped into something very, very new. So this new English is irredeemably different from the standard English at the colonial center, and it is separated by unbridgeable gap. So you have something like this new brand of English, and this is irredeemably different. That is, you cannot now go back to the standard English because you have changed it so much, and there is a vast gulf between the standard English and this new kind of English. And this bridge between the standard English and these varieties of English, even when you talk about Chinua Achebe, his famous work, can you name his famous work from the African writer Chinua Achebe? Haven't heard of him? Wherein a lot of African words are used in that. I'll come back to this question later. So this gap is positive and not negative. Why? Because you're creating a new identity with that new English. So it presents a difference through which an identity can be expressed. So why are you using that particular brand of English? Because you want to express that unique experience as a Malayali or that unique experience as a Nigerian. So these new Englishes, it cannot be converted into standard English because it has really gone beyond its limits. The rules are all broken. So you cannot go back to the standard variety of English. So this new English, it expresses new values, new identities, and new value systems. So using this kind of an English, what are you doing? You're actually rejecting the old colonial values, that old colonial value, that old colonial standard English, which was very, very rigid and it wanted to continue in a particular manner. So all that is rejected when you're appropriating English and making it your own. You're making it local. So this leads to a more politicized approach in the analysis of text primarily within historical and geographical context. And here, when you're doing this, what is happening? You are actually breaking and going away from what the Commonwealth critics tried to do. They were trying to look at the universal and the timeless values in the in these Commonwealth, or you could say post-colonial texts. So when you are appropriating the language, what are you doing? You're actually trying to be very historical and geographical. That is historical as in you are locating that story within your own history of your own area. And then again geographical, limited to that particular area. So the local concerns are very important. Local concerns become important, and you are not really worried about the universal and the timeless, and you're not trying to ape or follow the English canonical text. Is that clear? So when you're talking about post-colonial theory, there are three ways of looking at the text that came out of the colony, the colony's experience. The first one is you're looking at, or you're rereading the text. You're rereading the canonical literature. The other one is you're looking at the representation of the colonized people in these texts, and finally you're writing back to the center. Writing back is you're appropriating the language of the center and you're making it local. You're making it suitable to your needs, your customs, your traditions, and your sensibilities, and your writing. And when you do that, what is happening? There is created a huge gap between the standard language of the center and the variety of languages that we use. So you have standard English on one hand, and you have varieties of new Englishes. And now these new Englishes are actually a defiance, wherein you're breaking, you're distorting, you're changing the whole thing to suit yourself. You're breaking all the rules. Thereby, you're writing against the grain. You're actually not following any of the things that are considered to be very standard and sacrosanct by the Western canon. So it's a way of uh, defiance, and you're also decolonizing the language. Not only the mind, but also the language is getting decolonized. You are freeing the language from all the connotations of power and dominance, which was enjoyed by English once upon a time. Is this clear?
Yes, ma'am.